Hello, World Civ 107. Welcome to week 11. And no doubt we are all still trying to deal with what's happening right now. So I just want to keep continuing encouraging you all. I want to start off by kind of talking about still what we're dealing with, the coronavirus situation. I'm going to break away and kind of talk a little bit more in detail about the work that we're actually dealing with, and then I want to end kind of also reiterating some points to think about as we try to push through. So again, many of you are turning in the work and you're doing great. Awesome. You're pushing through. I know how difficult it is for you to do right now and to concentrate, and it's happening. So that's a great job. Some of you are still, I'm assuming, just super distracted. I'm still giving zeros to papers if they don't have works cited and dates. This is something that I've covered from the beginning of the class with many announcements, and I'm still having to remind students. I don't know why, but this needs to stop. Okay, so works cited and dates are something that need to be in all history papers always. And I've mentioned it's not research papers. The majority of the papers should be based on what we cover in the module. That's important. Okay, so let's keep our academic standards up during this hard time. Some students have been writing to me when they have difficulties or they have some questions. That's exactly what you need to do. So when you're struggling, communicate with me. Do that. I'm also catching some people cutting and pasting Wikipedia or some other articles. Okay, again, this is not the kind of thing that you should be a realm you should be delving into right now. So it's better that you turn in late work than turn into something to me that's not that's plagiarized. Okay, very very clear, very simple. Again, I want to mention to you that I am taking in late work with no questions asked. I wrote that to some of you, like, I cut and pasted. I'm just going to let you know when I see like the work wasn't turned in, I put 0, and then I say, well, when you turn it in, you'll get full points, if you turn in late work. And I definitely saw a tremendous drop of work coming in from my students of all 3 classes. Okay, so it's understood, but again, the semester's almost over, so I don't want you to get too far behind. Okay, and I am here for you. I am working from home. I'm basically living like in a prison cell, like many of you are. I'm not going out, and so in fact, I had the flu, and I called up the doctor, and it appears that I just had the flu, but I have to treat it like I'm potentially have something else and contagious, so I am staying inside. You need to remember that. And what the doctor told me, anything in the respiratory issue, anything with your respiratory issues is a big problem. I need to say something else. This morning, when I got on Facebook, one of the worst things that I saw was a friend of mine from Finland. He's way younger than me. He is a very active guy who has a great job, and he travels the world a lot. And so I'm 46, by the way. I'm looking older now that I'm growing my beard out and my hair, and this is what I'm doing during these times. But he showed a picture in the hospital, and it appears that he has the virus, and that it's actually like he doesn't just carrying it, he's hospitalized. He had to get carried in an ambulance. And this is him in Finland, okay? And he put out a warning to everybody to stop acting like this is just something that's not real, or only older or weaker compromised systems. We have to take it serious, okay? So I don't want you to be thinking in the negative. I want you to be positive by empowering yourself to make the right choices, all right? The staying in orders and all this stuff, it's boring as hell. We're all going nuts. My daughter calls me up all the time. She's making more videos on the internet than ever, or just like, but it's real. So let's flatten the curve, as they say. Okay, all right. Enough on that right now. We're covering such important work to understand the world that we live in now and what brought us here. And I'm glad that we're learning about China. I would have liked to actually emphasize, maybe stayed on one point where we had to cover so much in a short period of time. But this week's topics really personal to me in many ways. And more so now than when I originally made these videos. And again, I apologize for some of them, really poor quality that I had to make in a cafe with music, and I've just not been able to get the time to fix them. But right now, our president wants to call the coronavirus the Chinese virus. And that's controversial because the issue is that, as far as we know, it started in China. And there's been tensions between Trump and Xi Jinping in China right now. We all know that. I watch Fox News because I watch all different news channels to see how they're pitching things, and they're very much focusing on kind of making this a blame game against China. But we need to keep in mind that the Spanish influenza at the end of World War I that killed so many people did not start in Spain. The reason why it got that name is because Spain was one of the few countries not involved in World War I, and they weren't censoring their papers the way the United States and other European nations were. And so they were reporting on all of that was their big thing that they were dealing with. And so it seemed they were the only ones really, the flu became associated with them. We don't know for 100% certainty where it started, but it appears many sources pin it on coming from the United States. Should we call it the United States influenza of 1918? Does it matter? Why are we doing this right now? Right? We're in a global pandemic. This is a problem. This tit for tat, and then China's now trying to blame it on one of our soldiers. This is no good. We all need to be unifying to deal with one common enemy. But in this history, what you're learning, you're getting the background for the tensions that the United States and China have had, and getting a better understanding of what's been going on. And in the Cold War, also just kind of understanding more about the Vietnam War, which I would have liked to have focused on more as well. And what happened in Cambodia. I just want to mention a few things about Southeast Asia, because I was just there for so long. Thailand was anti-communist, and the regime there was a place that the United States government was able to really kind of mobilize around. Two different sources I've read pointed out that it was also the place where many U.S. troops were able to get some R&R from the war, but they also did that by going to a lot of sex workers in some of the bigger cities, and that, according to these books, sex work was always common in this area, but it was the amount of U.S. troops going into Thailand that really made it such a common thing and brought that industry into the fore. Okay, it's just something to point out. And in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge ended up fighting with Vietnam, and the United States did in fact end up supporting the Khmer Rouge on top of the bombing, and that's hard to fathom, but appears to be at least lightly because they were the enemy of the Viet Cong. Now, I lived just last year for 2 months, actually even up this year, losing track of time with everything. I came back from Hong Kong September 5th. And so that had been this year, I believe. Yes. 2 months in Siem Reap, Cambodia. I can tell you that the country is still barely recovering from the Khmer Rouge. The infrastructure is terrible. And that also makes me concerned about what's happening with what will happen with this coronavirus thing. I mean, a really, really bad infrastructure problem in Cambodia still is there. In terms of Hong Kong, though, I want to kind of switch gears and talk about that a little bit, because I spent 3 months in Hong Kong, and if any of you were paying attention, there have been, prior to the coronavirus issues, massive protests that were taking place in Hong Kong against the central government in China. And it might be a little confusing to some of you. So first of all, I just want to point out something. I was in Hong Kong at my friend's, he's an American, for almost 2 months prior to the demonstrations. And I remember, I mean, it's just 2 months, but I would go to the cafes a lot and talk to many people. There was no indication that any massive, huge demonstrations were going to be coming. And when I say massive, there was one demonstration where, okay, there's like 7.5 million people in Hong Kong, and I think there was estimated 2.5 million people in the streets. That's a lot of the population there in Hong Kong. And yeah, I even actually remember talking to some younger Hong Kong ethnic Chinese person, and and they were talking about how they feel like they're losing their freedom. And I said, "Oh, these kids know they're losing their freedom, but they don't have any fight in them." That's what I said. Well, I was totally wrong on that. And then I left. And then I came back in the middle of the demonstrations. Why I came back is a long set of stories to say. I started having visa problems and money problems, and so I ended up going from Thailand. I went from Cambodia to Thailand and then back into Hong Kong. And when I came there, the demonstrations were massive. The airport was intense. A lot of very punk rock signs saying things that I can't even repeat right now, which I was shocked about the kind of the very graphic charges of rage coming out of some of the younger people. And when I left there, while I was there, the Chinese government threatened to invade, and I watched a video of them doing that, and I thought that was going to happen, and it was a little intense. Now, I happened to make it back safe and sound. But I want to say a few things. If you didn't know, Hong Kong, and this should have been covered in one of our earlier classes, but I think it was in the textbook, Hong Kong was a part of China. In the 19th century, the British were trying to force China open to trade. China didn't want to. The British forced opium, drugs, that's right. They were pushing opium, like heroin stuff, like on to China. China, understandably, didn't want that brought into their country. They destroyed a boat that was trying to bring some of that into the drugs into the country. The British used that as a pretext for war. They strong-armed China and took Hong Kong Island into British possession, but then promised to give it back in like 100 years. It's a very odd thing, right? So then, basically, that's what happened. I mean, Hong Kong, okay, by the way, was actually occupied by the Japanese in World War II, and so they had to face that. So they were under the British occupation for, nearly a century, and then under Japanese occupation, and then they went back to the British, and then the British ended up giving back Hong Kong to mainland China. China, as we learn in this history, this lesson, this module, had a communist revolution. But they were handed back Hong Kong in the 90s when China was already transforming itself into a capitalist nation. And you read some of this, or their economy anyways, started opening up to markets. And Hong Kong at the time was a thriving capitalist island, but they were used to being under a British system. Now they did not have freedom in Hong Kong. Okay, the British did not give them political freedom. They did get certain liberties. So Hong Kong is more free than China in terms of what you can do, but they never had real democracy. And the British set them up in a way to give them back to mainland China with very limited democracy as well. And it's called one country, two systems. So Hong Kong is considered China by China, but they've allowed Hong Kong to mainly do their own thing for up to 50 years. And then Hong Kong is supposed to go back under full power of China. So I could be on Facebook and Instagram in Hong Kong. That was legal. But if I just took the boat over to Kowloon and then I drove into the new territories, and if I was across the border and used my passport, if I had the paperwork to be able to do that, I would immediately have the Great Firewall of China, and I would not be allowed to be on Facebook and Instagram, and I could only use WeChat, which is the Chinese government approved one that actually listens to you to make sure you're not saying any appropriate things. Okay, so that's how that works. And many of the people were protesting, young people that don't like the future of the idea of them being reintegrated. And it's complicated. Hong Kong Chinese people also speak Cantonese, and much of the mainlanders speak Mandarin. That's actually like maybe the same difference in spoken language as Portuguese is the Spanish. They don't understand each other. So there's also that factor. So there's a lot of complications. Now, here's the thing I just want to say to add to this. When I was there, I picked up this book. This was the one before the demonstrations, called The World According to Xi by Carrie Brown. This is a guy who writes for The Economist. And when you read this book, he was really talking about how the 21st century, the 2020, and especially 2021, was really going to be President Xi's century, and really talked about the rise of China and it as a global player. I want to remind you that as you learned in this week's modules, a lot of that had to do with the changing of the economic status and integrating themselves into global markets. And so when people talk about Communist China, yes, the Communist Party still rules. They still claim to be communist. They still claim to be socialist. But this is not the same China as Mao Zedong and the vision that originally the government had as from the history that early on that we've studied. Okay, so that's really important for you to understand. And I also want to point out that just as nobody predicted those demonstrations coming, and that really disrupted China's plans, and then the demonstrations had repercussions in Taiwan, which I don't have time to get into, which disrupted those plans, and then this unexpected problems with the disease, which China was didn't want to. Apparently, the doctor that warned them about it was silenced, and then he died of it, and then China finally had to quickly fix the problem. It really shows you how there's so many things in history that come up that people don't see coming, and then have repercussions bigger than what you expect. So right now, when we're looking at the world and we're seeing that one, it wasn't expected that China would ever rise to power the way that they have and be a global player. It wasn't expected that they would have all these problems that are now coming. And it's not expected that any of these of our nations would be having this problem. So when people say history repeats itself, I want to always make this statement. History repeats itself by always surprising us. Okay? That's how it repeats itself. But we do have many lessons that we can learn from history. And I'm hoping that you're, again, looking at these things as ways to help you kind of focus on an empowered way to look at moving forward in this coronavirus environment set of problems that we're having. That was a very long announcement. I don't know how many of you are actually going to listen to it from the beginning to the end, but those of you who did, thank you, and I hope you found this informative and helpful.